We're back with another episode of App Stories. Today's show is brought to you by Drop Zone. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
Good, good. We had a good conversation today in the pre-show for App Stories Plus listeners, all about backing up your Macs, as well as Federico's exploration of various apps and kind of what are the apps that feel right and fit right with his life these days, which I thought was a fun conversation. I mean, I know you're still on that exploration, but you've really settled on a lot at this point. I think you're in pretty good shape.
I've settled on a lot of things, both in terms of software and hardware, but there's still one item from my list that I'm not super convinced by. And that's listen to the pre-show to understand the context and what I will be doing over the holidays to figure it out.
Right. And you can get App Stories Plus by either subscribing to App Stories Plus by going to appstories.plus and checking out the plans there, or becoming a Club Premier member, which is all the goodies that you get with a Club Mac Stories membership plus App Stories Plus, which we deliver extended, early, and in high bitrate audio, ad-free. Just go to plus.club to learn more about Club Premier.
Can I pitch this episode like I did for you on iMessage a few days ago?
Yes, go for it. Yeah, you should. Yes.
So we were thinking, like, what do we want to talk about on App Stories next week? And I was on the couch and I was thinking. I do most of my thinking time on the couch, just staring at my iPad and be like, okay, let me think. And I had this idea. So on the excellent ongoing TV show For All Mankind, which you don't watch for some reason, but I do. So the whole show is based on this premise, sort of like the butterfly effect, like change a single event in history and witness how that single event leads to a whole series of consequences and ramifications that in some subtle ways and much, much bigger ways alter the course of events. So I started thinking, in For All Mankind, they took the course of human history, and more specifically modern space exploration, but they changed one detail. What if the Russians landed on the moon before the Americans in the 60s? And the show goes from there. So change one event and see how the timeline adapts to that change. And so I thought, why don't we do something like that for an App Stories episode? And my idea was we each pick a couple, and I ended up picking one because it's a big one. But you picked a couple. What if we pick a couple of things, make a couple of changes to Apple's timeline, pick a thing that would have gone differently, and discuss how that would have impacted Apple and the rest of the tech industry for years to come. So that's the pitch for the What If episode of App Stories about Apple history.
Yeah, no, I love this idea when you came up with it. I knew immediately what I wanted to talk about.
Okay, go for it.
All right, my first pick is related to my recent project, which was restoring a fifth generation iPod video. And my what if is, what if the iPod had never been released?
Okay. Wow. All right.
So now we're turning the clock back pretty far to the turn of the 21st century, basically. And that, when you think about it, the iPod represents such a turning point for Apple, because it really was when the company got deep into consumer electronics. It was very much a computer company still at the time when the iPod was released. But the iPod was really the first step in a long process that ended up with the iPhone and many other things down the road. And when I think about it, I look at my old iPod, the 5th gen, and there's so much there that speaks to what the devices that came later. There's the click wheel in particular, which I think about a lot because I've been playing with this old iPod, which is a touch interface. And that was the first, touch interface. Well, maybe not. I guess there's trackpads, but it was, the direct it was a lot closer to a direct manipulation of what you were doing, which was listening to music or scrolling through photos and things. And it became one of those almost fidget habits, scrolling around and around on the click wheel, a lot like scrolling through a timeline in social media years later. And so I think, the iPod had a big impact both on touch interfaces, but also consumer electronics and media industry that Apple ultimately got into. Because before this, it didn't happen immediately, but eventually the iTunes store was launched as a result of the iPod. And that led from music eventually to things like TV and movie rentals. And now we've got an actual Apple streaming network, which you wouldn't have ever, thought that Apple would be making its own movies with its own studio and commissioning others to do the same for a streaming channel. And I think a lot of this all comes back to this device, which was at the time a very simple device. When you crack open an iPod, you realize that all it is this shell with a hard drive in it and a couple of input devices and boards in there that essentially lets you navigate through a long list of files. It's just a playback mechanism for a few file types, but it really, I think, was such a hit and such a massive hit that it probably also has a lot to do with Apple refining its supply chain too, and which obviously made it possible for them to make an iPhone down the road. So yeah, I think if we didn't have the iPod, I think the iPhone would have been a lot less likely.
Interesting. So there's no roll the clock back to early 2000s. There's no iPod. So Apple is left sort of innovating with the Mac.
Right.
And this change alone has deep ramifications, like you say, for the iPhone. Because without an iPod, would there be an iPhone? I still think there would be an iPhone.
Would probably be very different though, right?
Interesting. Maybe it would be something more like a miniaturized Mac, sort of like one of those, what were they called, like PDAs back in the day?
I think that would probably be the case, because I don't think, here's the thing, is that when the iPhone finally came along in 2007, the pitch was that it was so much more than a phone. I think if the iPod hadn't existed, it would have been more like a phone. The phone would have been more central. The media part of it would have taken a back seat. I think you'd still have a web browser and that kind of thing, and you'd still be surfing your contacts and using your calendar and things like that. So have those kind of computer-like functions. But I don't know. I think the fact that it was a music player really gave Apple a nudge with the iPhone into the entertainment space, which ultimately also, I think, helped develop the App Store ultimately too.
Yeah, without an iPod, maybe we would have gotten an iPhone, but years before. So I think we would have gotten an iPhone before 2007. And I think your assumption is correct, that without an iPod, the iPhone, say that an iPhone comes out in 2004, that iPhone looks a lot more like a phone, I think, in terms of like, it's not because the iPhone, when it came out, and it's hard to imagine this now, but you gotta keep in mind how the iPhone looked like nothing else on the market. Right. We had quote unquote smartphones, and they were terrible. Like every single thing about them was terrible. The web browsers that they had, the messaging apps that they had, the Bluetooth connectivity, everything was horrible about those phones. The cameras, oh my God, the cameras were so bad. Yeah. How tiny screens where you could make out really chunky pixels on them. So I do think that without an iPod, and obviously the iPhone looks nothing like an iPod, but I think it's sort of the focus of the iPod, because you got to keep in mind that the iPod that came out in 2001 is very different from the iPods that we had in 2006, right? At that point, you had iPods that could play video and iPods that could play like movies. You could download movies and TV shows on your iPod. You could play games on your iPod. Do you remember iPod click wheel games?
I do. I actually have some of those backed up somewhere on my Mac. I had Sonic. I think I had the poker game that has Phil Schiller in it.
Wasn't there a Final Fantasy game? Squaresoft or Square? I guess Square Enix.
Square Enix, yeah. I think they
They
did do one.
did.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. There were a whole bunch of them. I mean, there were maybe, I shouldn't say a whole bunch of them. There were probably like a dozen different games at one point or another. And I remember Sonic, it was like maybe Sonic 2. I forget which one it was, but yeah, Sonic was on there and a bunch of others. But, and that's another, I mean, that's a precursor to the App Store when you think about it. Mm-hmm. And the other, I guess, angle on this is that the iPod is really what kind of got me interested in Apple in the first place. And I do wonder whether, if there hadn't been an iPod, whether the Mac would be doing what it's doing today as well, you know?
Because a lot of people sort of, that's where the idea of the halo effect comes from. People who got an iPod.
Right. I was syncing my iPod with a Windows PC when I got it. I mean, because that's what we had in our house. And it wasn't until a few years later that I bought my first Mac, which was an iMac.
And I think it's also fair to assume that if you change this one thing about Apple history, so the iPod never existed, I think long term, we wouldn't have gotten Apple Music in 2015. Mm-hmm. I think Apple would have been even late, and Apple was late to the music streaming market, right? Apple was the last one, I think, to do a music streaming service. I think it's fair to assume that the iTunes Store maybe the iTunes Store would have never launched, actually. Like, I think without an iPod, the fact that Apple refers to itself as, music is in our DNA, I think that whole chunk of Apple history is gone. Like, if the iPod is gone, that whole part of Apple's identity is gone.
Yeah.
And so I think we would have gotten an iPhone because I think there were many sort of forces driving the development of the phone at that point. But I think you're right in saying that you wouldn't have had that media experience, at least not how we think of it. Like, the original iPhone had a built-in iPod. Like, it wasn't called music, it was called the iPod.
Right. Yeah, and it's kind of, I mean, it's so interesting to me too, because when you look at it in the grand scheme of Apple's history, the iPod represents a fairly short period of time because they released it, they iterated on it very quickly into lots of different models up and down the price points, and then they killed it almost all at once. I mean, we had an iPod Touch for several years after we had an iPhone, but what people think of as a traditional iPod and not like an iPhone without the phone part, those went away pretty quickly once we had the iPhone. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Drop Zone 4. Drop Zone is a Mac app that redefines the drag and drop experience. The app accelerates file transfers, simplifies application launching, and seamlessly integrates with a bunch of different services, optimizing your workflows and increasing your productivity. Drop Zone is the kind of everyday productivity tool that offers immediate results with shortcuts to your most commonly used tasks. Set up your frequently used actions once and simply drag and drop files into the shortcuts icons Drop Zone creates to perform all of your saved actions. Move, copy, and share files in an instant or create your very own actions. You'll wonder immediately how you lived without Drop Zone, sitting quietly in your menu bar on the ready to speed up all sorts of file transfers and other tasks every day. I've set up the app to make it easy to send files to commonly used folders in cloud services. You can use it with things like Imager, Google Drive, YouTube, SFTP, and Amazon S3 to name a few. But you could also use it to send files to applications. Stop wrestling with the Finder and use Drop Zone to make working with files infinitely easier. Of course, one of the best aspects of Drop Zone is that it works the way you do because it's highly customizable. You can use it to resize images, shorten URLs, send attachments via email, and a whole lot more. Plus, Drop Zone supports hotkeys for every action, so you can use it without ever touching your mouse or trackpad again. Another cool feature that I like is the drop bar, where you can keep files handy for using, whether you use them frequently or whether you're assembling a bunch of them to attach to an email or something. It's a lot easier than wrestling with the Finder. Plus, Drop Zone is updated regularly and works great with macOS Sonoma. And just for App Stories listeners, Drop Zone is currently offering a limited time deal. You can get 30% off Drop Zone 4 Pro by visiting apptonic.com/appstories today. Again, that URL is apptonic.com/appstories for 30% off Drop Zone 4 Pro. I'll put a link in the show notes too. Our thanks to Drop Zone 4 by Apptonic for their support of App Stories.
Let me do mine, and then I know you have an extra one, which is very interesting. So, in my imaginary timeline, the iPad was never released, and so imagine, what if the iPad never launched? There's an iPhone, there's no iPad in 2010. What does that timeline look like? So, again, it's important to contextualize here. Imagine like Apple released the iPhone in 2007, massive success that honestly changed the world, right? Because the iPhone in many ways reshaped society because it invented the modern idea of the modern smartphone, which has become the modern portable computer for billions of people on Earth.
Right. You literally could not imagine a modern phone not looking like an iPhone, essentially.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair statement. Not because we like Apple, but because it's just how history went. The iPhone invented the modern phone, which is the most important device in our lives. And it's as easy as that. So 3 years later, Apple, and I remember this because I was already writing Mac stories at the time. Apple was under a lot of pressure from the tech industries like tech observers and Wall Street. And everybody was asking them, what's next? Like, you have this incredible hit on your hands. What are you doing next? Can Steve Jobs, come up with another hit that is going to change the world? And there were rumors of an Apple tablet for years, leading up to the unveil of the original iPad in January 2010. And I recall, and you did an article about this where you collected all the crazy mock-ups and concepts.
I did, yeah. There were a lot of them were very Mac-like, is a lot of what people imagined, yeah.
There was so much anticipation about the Apple tablet, as they called it. At some point, it was a lot of people were referring to it as the Apple Canvas, and then the Apple iTab, the iTablet. It was wild to witness the lead up to that event. And just like the iPhone, I think it's fair to say that in many ways, the iPad created the modern tablet category. There's a before the iPad. We had tablets before. Of course, there was the Newton in the 90s. There were Windows tablets before, but they sucked. Yep. They were
really bad, yeah.
They were the Windows, what were they running? Windows XP? On a touch screen. There was passive touch screen, and you had to use a stylus. The modern tablet, as you think of it, like a slab of glass that supports multi-touch, it didn't exist. And then the iPad was unveiled, and it existed after that. So that's a key point in history that we're changing in this timeline. So let's imagine the iPad never invented the modern tablet category. I was actually discussing this point with Sylvia over at lunch today, and she looks at me, she's like, that's exactly how I think how my life is. I never used an iPad. I have my phone, and I have my iPhone, and I have my Mac. And I think that's an interesting argument, because despite the iPad's massive success, a lot of people still just have an iPhone and a MacBook, right?
True. Yeah, I think that's very true for a lot of people. I will counter it with this, though, is that Jennifer doesn't use a Mac. Really ever. I mean, I have a login for her on my Air, and she uses it once in a while for a few things, but for the most part, she uses an iPad mini, and for her, that is her computer if it's not her phone. I mean, I think if there was no iPad, she would still have, like a Kindle, because she uses a Kindle a lot. She would have her phone to do computing, but I bet a lot of people who still needed or wanted some kind of hybrid computer in their life, maybe there would have been more Chromebooks. Maybe the Chromebook would have taken off.
Let me get to that. So let's imagine that the iPad 2010 goes by. There's no iPad. It was never unveiled. Steve Jobs passes away. Unfortunately, there's no iPad. So the big question looming over this imaginary timeline is, in this alternative timeline of human history, does someone else come out with the idea of the modern tablet?
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone else do it? And I think yes. So if the iPhone exists, I think someone else would have come out with the modern idea of a touch tablet. And in thinking about this, I believe that two things would have happened here. So Google was already working on Android, and famously, they rethought a lot of components of Android after the unveil of the iPhone and iPhone OS.
Right.
So I think in this timeline, we will look at the tablet market be sort of divided between two companies. Google with Android tablets, and I think actually who would have gotten a real good shot here at not missing mobile and creating a category is Microsoft.
Yeah, I agree.
I think in this timeline, Windows tablets would have made a huge comeback. And I'll go deeper. I think in this timeline, Windows 10 and the Metro UI were never a failure, and they would still be here with us today.
Oh, I like that, because it is very much a UI that would have worked better on a popular tablet.
Yep. Yeah. So in this timeline, I think someone else, because I think the tablet as an idea needs to exist in people's lives, but I think someone else.
Yeah, and I think it would have because of the phones, because you're not suggesting that we wouldn't have had an iPhone. So I think someone would have blown the iPhone up eventually, even if Apple didn't do it.
Yep, exactly. So let's get back to Apple now. So with no iPad, what is Apple doing? I think in this timeline, Apple would be still under a lot of pressure to come up with a new device. And I think we will still get an Apple Watch, but there's a few adjustments that need to happen in this timeline. I think Apple, first off, would have accelerated the development of MacBooks with touch input. Because if in this timeline, Google and Microsoft are doing tablets, and Apple missed the tablet revolution, Apple would be caught, without a compatible product. And they would have accelerated the development of MacBooks with touch. So the opposite of what we have today. And I think because of that, a lot of things in macOS land would be different. For example, I don't believe we would have gotten a massive redesign of macOS with, what was it, Yosemite? That was a big redesign of macOS?
Yeah, I guess as you could trace it back that far. Yeah, you're right, because there was this whole realignment of the OSs, and it wouldn't have been necessary, right? It
wouldn't have been necessary because the iPad UI was never created.
Right.
And if the iPad UI was never created, interface elements that we're using today, like popovers, for example. Apple invented popovers, like the modern idea of a contextual popover was invented with iPhone OS 3.2 and the original iPad. Those never made it to other platforms. So I think the redesign of macOS to use touch would have happened way before Yosemite, even when Macs were still using Intel. And I still think that Apple would have done Apple Silicon later, but I think we would have gotten Intel MacBooks with touch and a redesign years before Yosemite.
I was going to say, it'd be really interesting to see what that competition between Apple and Microsoft would look like in that context, because I think we would have gotten devices that look a lot more like the Microsoft Surface a lot earlier and probably a lot better over time.
Yep. In this timeline, I also think that Apple, caught by surprise, without a tablet, they would have accelerated development of touch Macs, but they would have also continued down the road of bigger iPhones. So I still think that we would have gotten bigger iPhones in 2014, but the iPod Touch was never discontinued. And in fact, they made a bigger iPod Touch to try and have something in between a phone and a tablet. And the iPod Touch was never canceled. It was made bigger with the iPhone OS UI, of course, and sold as a more affordable device for kids because, those kids that started using tablets and iPads to play games, those kids still needed something.
Sure.
So in this timeline, parents would buy a big iPod Touch and give it to their kids. And also, sold as the equivalent of an iPad mini, like a more affordable touch screen that's big enough for games and watching TV shows and reading books.
Yeah, I like it. I think that's fascinating to me. I think, I wonder if in this timeline we'd still be using the word phablet. Probably not. It was a bad word to begin with, but I kind of want to bring phablet back.
You want to bring phablet back?
I do.
Lastly, a few more things to consider. With no iPad, there's probably, or maybe they would have done it regardless. What about universal purchases on the App Store? Now we're so used to having a single app that's iPhone, iPad, and Mac. That would have probably been different. With no iPad, there would be no Mac Catalyst.
True.
There's no need for Mac Catalyst with no iPad. And lastly, and I'll leave you with this, with no iPad OS, would Vision OS be based on Mac apps and Mac OS?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That's a very interesting one because I think the iPhone would not have really cut it. I mean, interesting.
This is all imaginary, but I'm trying to follow, the for all mankind approach of like change one thing and think of all the ramifications later on.
Right. No, and it's one of those things that if you study what Apple does for long enough, you see all these patterns and you see how one product leads to the other, and you see how realigning the iPad and the Mac has a lot to do with Vision OS too, because it's like they're that freeing those apps from constraints of a certain size class and creating overlap in the way that the UIs work from a design standpoint all work to the benefit of Vision OS too, which I think we'll be seeing a lot of once we get our hands on them next year.
All right, hit me with your second.
I want to go back to the 90s, Federico.
Okay.
And I know you love the 90s, so let's go back. Let's go all the way back to 1994 and 1995 and talk about Apple's console, its gaming console, which there may be some listeners who are not familiar with it, but they had a console called the Pippin that was released in 1995. And we are talking about a period of history. This was a collaboration with Bandai, and it was designed for CD-ROM games. This is kind of what the time period we're talking about here. This is when there was a PlayStation and a Sega Saturn, but we didn't have the Xbox even yet. This was before the Xbox ever debuted. And it cost $600, and there were only ever 45,000 of these things made. So that's just by way of background. My question is, what if the Pippin had been a hit?
Oh my God.
All right. And the Pippin ran a stripped down version of System 7. And it was very much, I guess, kind of like it was very much of its time. It was very much about CD-ROM games. It had a look that has a very, very beige, boxy look. It was before Apple was really designing beautiful computers again yet, because it was before Steve Jobs came back. Steve Jobs killed this, by the way. It was one of the things he got rid of. But
it kind of looks like a Sega Dreamcast.
It does look a little bit like a Dreamcast. It's a little chunkier than Dreamcast, I think, but it does. And the controller to me is very interesting because it looks like a croissant, maybe. It's like a half moon.
It looks like, and this is a deep cut, it looks like the prototype DualShock for the PlayStation 3.
Oh.
Are you familiar with the banana DualShock?
Yes. I haven't thought about that in a very long time. But you're right.
Me neither, but I just thought of it. Yeah.
It had a trackball on it too, which is just, I guess that was for navigating menus and things probably. I don't know. It was a little bit wild, but here's the thing. This device fits in a lot of ways with some of what came later. You can think, to me, it reminds me a little bit of the original Apple TV, because the original Apple TV was this box with a stripped down version of OS X in it that was designed to play whatever you downloaded. This was running System 7 and was designed to play CD-ROM games that you might have otherwise played on your Mac. And I do wonder, what if this had become a hit and Apple had actually become a player in the gaming industry? Because it wasn't too long after the Pippin was released, and it was still being supported, that Halo was announced, and it was announced for the Mac. But before it was released, that happened in 1999, I think. But before it was released, Microsoft introduced the Xbox, stole Halo away from the Mac by buying Bungie, and released it as part of the Xbox. And that has been kind of the flagship game since the very beginning of the Xbox, really. It really is what put the Xbox on the map and made people want to buy it in those early days, at least. And can you imagine if the Pippin had become something and expanded beyond CD-ROM games and had been the console that had Halo in 1999, and that Apple then had used its hardware chops to build a good controller, that maybe today we would have Apple Arcade games on Apple TV with an Apple controller and a Vision OS coming out
is incredible.
Right, with its own controllers, as opposed to doing hand gestures and tracking that way. I feel like there's just a lot here, because this was right around the time that companies like Microsoft were experimenting with set-top boxes too. And it could have accelerated Apple's move into the entertainment industry as well, I think. But
I think in this timeline, so Halo was showed off at Macworld 1999.
Right.
And it was announced by Steve Jobs at Macworld.
Yeah, it was.
I think in this timeline, had the Pippin been successful, Halo would have launched in, say, 2000 on the Pippin 2. I think in this timeline, there would have been a Pippin 2.
Yep.
I think so Halo too. As a launch title.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, think about that. I mean, because Marathon was a big deal on the Mac for a lot of years before that, and Marathon kind of morphed into Halo. It's an interesting to think about what would happen if Apple had actually had a hit on its hands with the Pippin, but I don't think it really, it obviously didn't take off. 45,000 were sold. And I think I read that Bandai supported it up until like 2002, which, good for them. They supported it for 7 years. There weren't a ton of games for it either. I found a good YouTube video that Stephen Hackett had linked that has some examples of some of the games on it. And they're very much CD-ROM style games, which you look at them now and it's like, I don't know. They're like point and click games, basically. But Stephen has written about the Pippin more than once, so I'll put a couple of links in the show notes to his articles, because he has some good background on the Pippin and how it, all the specs and everything that went along with it.
There are a few Pippin on eBay, but they go for like 1,500 euros. Well, this was fun, John. I love this pick. Well done.
Yeah, let us know what you thought of the episode, because we may revisit this. We have other ideas. I mean, one thing, as we were sitting here getting ready to record, I came up with another couple. So this is something we could definitely do another time. All right, Federico, I want to thank our sponsor for this episode. That is Drop Zone. You can find the two of us over at MacStories.net and on Mastodon. Just go to Vitici.MacStories.net or JohnVorhees.MacStories.net to find us on Mastodon. And we're on Instagram, where Federico is at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.